Just who were the Romans? Talk number 4. Number 4 in a planned series of 9. And I've called this one Taking Over a Sea. Number 4 in the series, the first one is what I call Taking Over the Past, where they plundered the past to give themselves a sort of official version of how they began. Taking over a hill when they first moved down and took over one of the 7 hills of Rome. The third one was taking over a country, Italy. Now this one is about taking over an entire sea, the Mediterranean. Not just the sea, of course, but the land all around it. By 272 BC, they were in a position to have a go at doing just that. They had beaten King Pyrrhus of Epirus, and now they're in a position to look further out, to extend their frontiers, to extend, quite literally, their horizons. Remember, to them, to the people who lived there, the Mediterranean was not a barrier, it was a high road. It was a binder, not a barrier. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, which means our sea. They had a very proprietary air to it. By the end of it, of course, they ran not only what was on the sea, they ran all the land around it. Well, we look back and say, oh, now they're ready to take over an empire. They didn't think of it like that. Like most of things in history, it's really just one damn thing after another. But that was the way they went, and that was the way it seemed that they were reasonably content to go. They had no blueprint, but one thinks of the British Empire as something planned. It wasn't. It just happened. It was one thing after another. And it's exactly the same with the Romans. Many cases they claimed that they'd done it in order to protect their frontiers. Hence the somewhat cynical remark that most empires conquer their empire in self-defense. The Roman Empire, somebody said, conquer the world in self-defense. All aggressive powers do it. However big they are, usually the bigger they are, the more aggressive they are, the more they claim that they're doing it all in self-defense. They're doing it almost for your benefit. What is going to happen? I've divided this roughly into 2. In terms of actual events, what's relevant to the conquering of the Roman Empire as it became, not yet, as it became. The western half came first. By this time, when the proper histories were being written, 200 or 300 years later, the two, what you might call proper historians, who lived round about the time of the reign of Augustus, where AD is beginning to arise after BC, or wherever you like, where BC is becoming AD. One was called Livy, L-I-V-Y, Titus Livius. He was Roman. The other one was a man called Polybius, P-O-L-Y, Polybius, B-I-U-S. He was Greek. And these were what you might call professional historians doing a proper job, looking at the evidence, trying to give a balanced account. And the history of the western half, as I said, is largely concerned, we could boil it right down, to one single place, namely the city of Carthage. Rome fought 3 wars against Carthage, and they're known in the history books as the Punic Wars, P-U-N-I-C, Punic Wars. Why? Because Carthage was originally a colony founded by the ancient trading city of Phoenicia. In Latin, the Phoenicians come out as the Poeni, and we have anglicized them into not Punic Wars, but Punic Wars. That's how they become known in the books, the Punic Wars. If people have read a book or two and you say Punic Wars, you say, oh yes, wasn't that something to do with Hannibal? And certainly if you say to people, Hannibal, oh yes, the elephants, we've got round to the elephants, have we? Well, didn't quite, that didn't come till the Second Punic War. But they made the acquaintance of elephants fighting against Pyrrhus. It must have unnerved them a bit to see them for the very first time on the battlefield. Well, there isn't time here to go into all the details because I've only got a certain number of minutes to cover this particular part of the history of the Roman Empire. There's a lot more to come, and I've only got 9 talks altogether. So there were 3 wars. The first war was a real slog, ran for over 20 years. there were ups and downs. The Romans could claim that yes, in the end, they'd won it. They usually did in the end. The Romans were like that. Very difficult to shift, very difficult. The Romans wore you, the Romans got you in the end, as a general rule. Anyway, the first war, the First Punic War, was a real slog, but the Romans did win. Second Punic War came out as a real epic. It ran from 218 BC to 202. What's that, 16 years? And that, as I say, became an epic. The third one, by which time the Romans really were top dog, and they needed only 3 or 4 years before they polished off Carthage altogether, the Third Punic War. Each one had, as I said, epic proportions. Each one, quite frankly, is worthy of a full series in itself, on its own. But we haven't got time for that. So what were the results of the Punic Wars? The final battle, the Battle of Zama, Z-A-M-A, in North Africa in 202 BC, was one of the great decisive battles. Why? Because if Rome had lost that, if Carthage had won the Punic Wars in the end, Rome might have vanished from the map altogether 200 years before the birth of Christ. So the world would have never known anything about the Roman Empire that we know. All right, they wouldn't have known about Julius Caesar and the gladiators, but they wouldn't have known about anything else. About the provinces all over what is now Europe. They wouldn't have known about Roman law, Roman laws, Roman culture, Roman literature, Roman philosophy, the Roman Catholic Church, because Rome helped to set it up. All that would not have appeared. Zama dictated what would happen. Mind you, we don't know what Carthage would have done if it had had the chance. But it seems unlikely that they would have matched the Romans' achievement. Zama was a great turning point, a great decisive battle. Another result was the emergence and the establishment of one part of the Roman government, namely the Senate. This was the gathering of, as the word suggests, senior, and actually the word senex simply means old man. We get it in senile and senescence and all these other words in English. They simply chose the older people who knew a thing or two more and let them run the place. And the gathering that they had, the building they met in, the very organization itself became known as the Senate. And the Senate became the central organ of Roman government. They had, I say, the age, they had the experience, they had the clout, they had the money, they had the presence, the confidence, whatever you like. And of course, they had survived all those terrible wars against Carthage, particularly the second one, when Rome came within a whisker of being wiped off the map. And the Senate, most of the senators anyway, there must have been a few weak ones, most of the senators stayed firm, and this established their reputation for good and all. They provided the stubbornness, the sheer head down survival, will to win, sheer bloody mindedness, if you like, not knowing when they were beaten. But it did them no end of good. By the end of the Punic Wars, the Senate's authority was absolutely unassailable, and the motions they passed in their debates tended to have the force of law. So Zama is one result, the emergence of the Senate is another. During the course of the Second Punic War, as I said, they came up against this remarkable man called Hannibal. Without going into details, Hannibal has spent 15 years campaigning in Italy trying to beat Rome. Never mind all the military side issues of that, but think of what it meant to have a country where war is being waged right across it from top to bottom for very nearly 15 solid years. It must have had a colossal impact. A lot of depopulation, obviously, general economic decline, as you would expect. Lots of people left with nothing, perhaps, in the countryside, so they tended to drift to towns, nothing else to do. They had to look for a house, they had to look for a job. that seemed to be the place to go. They left a lot of land behind, and as always, there are people willing to take advantage of somebody else's misfortune. So wealthy speculators bought up large lands, dirt cheap, literally. By this time, they'd won enough wars, won enough campaigns to have a lot of slaves to run these large estates, and they went in for big cash crops. It wasn't the case anymore of the head of the household running a little small holding and feeding his family. Oh no, great big estates were the general rule of the game, up and down the fertile part of Italy. Don't forget, a lot of Italy was mountains. So they grew corn, and they grew wine, and they grew olives, and various other things, but those three particularly, to feed the ever-growing cities. The old farmer-soldier phenomenon was dying out. Once upon a time, farmers expected now and again to pick up their sword and fight for their country. Not so much now. The army, by the end of the Punic Wars, or certainly shortly afterwards, the army was becoming full-time professional. You signed up for 20 years. And there wasn't a great deal of industry. Warfare never encourages industry, and there wasn't much to go on in Italy. Don't forget, it was a period of very limited technology, to say the least. One doesn't want to be patronizing about Roman technology, but compare it with the modern age. Of course, there's no contest, is there? Which is another reason, the main reason why they wanted so many slaves to run the thing. And so more and more people drifted to cities. More and more people found it more and more difficult to get jobs in cities. So you tended to get more and more difficult to handle groups of working class, unemployed. So the beginnings of the famous city mob, not only in Rome, but especially in Rome, because Rome by now was far and away the biggest city in Italy. And so it became a big problem for politicians to know how to keep this crowd tame. A mob runs riot. Don't forget, there's no Roman police force. And the army were not allowed to march into Rome. They kept politics and military affairs strictly different. So running Rome and keeping it peaceful was quite a headache for the men whose responsibility it was to keep it going. They did it, of course, by a variety of trickery, a variety of pandering to their lower interests, if you like. In other words, to feed them, to give them a free handout. It started with cheap corn. It finished up with free corn. They've got the free handout quite regularly. And the rest of the time, how to keep them amused by giving them things to laugh at, give them things to watch. Blood and thunder, the famous games, the gladiators and the circuses and the sea battles in the amphitheatre and all the rest. That was how you kept the mob tame. That's what the cynic said. You did it with bread and circuses. In Latin, panem et circenses. Panem, P-A-N-E-M, is the French word pain. Et and C-I-R-C-E-N-S-E-S, circenses, bread and circuses. Another phenomenon of the period was the growth of a new class of people. The more the Romans conquered territory, the more they had to travel, the more they had to trade, the more they did business, the more money was being made. And sooner or later, there's going to be a group of people who are concentrating on making that money. The businessmen, the capitalists, the entrepreneurs, the ones who took the chances, the ones who invested, and the ones who, if they didn't collapse, reaped the profits. And these became known as the knights. Not quite sure why. The Latin word for it is equites. We get our word equestrian from it. E-Q-U-I-T-E-S, the equites. And they became quite a powerful unit in Roman society. The Senate, the patricians, the upper class, the aristocracy, rather looked down the noses at the equites. They thought business was a grubby activity. Similar prejudice against what the aristocracy in England referred to as trade. Business merchants were looked down upon by the aristocracy, and usually it happened in other places as well. Finally, another result of all this, I'm terribly oversimplifying, I'm afraid, but I'm up against time. Those military victories meant that the Romans had more land to control, more land to run. They had to send out governors to run all those other pieces of land. And they needed larger and larger armies, which over the years became more and more professional, necessarily, in order to conquer them in the first place. And that meant that the further away the conquest went, the further away the armies had to go, the more the soldiers tended to rely on the generals who were running them. Don't forget, they signed up for 20 years. They looked to their generals to see they were all right. And the generals would respond, "That's all right, lads, I'll see you okay. When your service is over, you'll get your land, and you'll get," well, they may not have got a pension, but they certainly got land. They wanted a farm to retire to, and why not? That took care of the western half. Now, what about the eastern half? Again, I repeat, this is gross oversimplification. But the east was a different prospect. In the west, it had been places like Italy, Corsica, Sardinia, Spain, North Africa. Generally speaking, on the whole, more rural, less sophisticated, except Carthage, of course, which was highly sophisticated. But Rome had destroyed that, wiped it off the map completely. In the east, there were a lot of old civilizations, a lot of old monarchies. Damn it, the Egyptian monarchy, the pharaohs, went back to 4,000 years BC. 4,000 years BC. The others weren't as old as that. But most of them had a pretty lengthy, lineage to boast of. That meant that they were more assured, they were more confident, in many cases more sophisticated. In places like Egypt, Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, Syria, cities all over the place, and as far as the Romans are concerned, with culture galore. Against them, the Romans might have fought successfully against them and in the end defeated them. But culturally, compared with all those Eastern societies, the Romans were bumpkins and regarded as such by many of those soldiers in the East who had been defeated by the Romans. You see, against Carthage, it had been straight rivalry, first of all. But later on, greed inevitably inspires people to go abroad and make more money, naturally. But in the case of a man like Hannibal, it was a good deal more than trying to win a war. It was, with Hannibal, sheer survival. Because of Hannibal, Rome came within a whisker of being completely destroyed, and the Romans never forgot it. So their triumph finally over Carthage in the end was all the more savage, because they had been frightened out of their wits, and they just came through by the skin of their teeth. In the Eastern Mediterranean, it was a different matter. The East produced no Hannibal to scare the daylights out of the Romans. So they took them on piecemeal, by and large, knocked them off one after the other. And by that time, of course, their motives had become different. They were not threatened with complete annihilation, as they had been with Hannibal. They were motivated by wealth, by the prospect of loot. It was land grabbing, it was exploitation. And the more successful they were, of course, the more drunk they became with their success. The more it went to their head. It was a very human progression. And the more they became convinced of their own superiority, with one exception. It didn't all go one way. The East, although it had been conquered by the Romans, as somebody famously remarked, Greece, though conquered, in the end conquered their conquerors. You'll see why in a minute. The Greeks didn't call themselves Greeks. The Graeci, the Romans version, Graeci, was simply one tribe amongst those who lived in what we call Greece today. The Greeks called themselves Hellenes. They were very conscious of the fact that they were different. Well, so many people are, aren't they? The Israelites knew that they were the chosen people, and so on. But the Hellenes were very proud of the fact that they were special, that they were different. In fact, they divided the human race into two. You were either a Greek or you were a barbarian. Didn't necessarily mean that you were uncivilized. It just meant that you weren't Greek. But that was their attitude to the rest of society. They did think rather a lot of themselves, but with good reason. Their country, which they called Hellas, you see it on the postage stamps today. Greek was the medium of culture. The Romans, when they came up against it, must have been a bit surprised and baffled to begin with. But they ran into all this religion and science and education, all the great philosophers, the great dramatists. You could rattle off the names, I'm sure. The Romans, as I said, were bumpkins by comparison, but to their eternal credit, they did recognize class when they met it, and they swallowed a lot of Greek culture. Not all Romans, but those who did really went overboard. As I said, Greek culture, the Greek language, Greek science, Greek education. To many Roman national families, Greek became a part of education. Greek became a necessary second language. Really educated Romans could not call themselves educated unless they could speak Greek as well. There was, as I said, an opposition to this. The old Roman rearguard, the old gang, the dyed in the wool, the stick in the muds, if you like, the old traditional lovers of the past in the good old days. They fought a long rearguard action against these new softy Greek lovers who, in fact, they think had been infected by, not affected, but infected by Greek culture. And so they'd gone soft. They got into easy habits. They indulged in all sorts of luxuries, if you like, that the Romans normally had frowned upon. That, of course, is only a short step away from the corruption brought about by soft living and the temptations of the easy life. Isn't it funny how the East is so often associated with corruption and decadence? A lot of peculiar religions came out of the East too, which didn't sit well with a lot of traditional Roman families and Roman beliefs. So you had, growing up, again very slowly, I'm gradually, and I'm simplifying, a split, if you like, between those who wanted to progress, who become more sophisticated or more educated, more with the world, and those who still clung to the old traditional virtues. They were the ones which they said had made Rome great. Greece wasn't going to make them any greater. Finally, the Romans had accumulated this huge amount of land. They were now running an entire sea and a very, very large percentage of the land all the way around that sea. Look at that. Any map of the countries around the Mediterranean, Rome ran pretty well all of them. By the end of the year 100, something like that, possibly a bit later, all moving on, if you like, towards the changeover from BC to AD. They weren't a young, up-and-coming, a little bit unsure of themselves, bumpkin city-state anymore. They ran this huge amount of land, or they were landed with running it. Now they had to work out how they were going to do it. But they'd also got used to winning, and they got to like winning. And they got to like all the profits that came from winning. You know, the jewelry from the East, the fancy materials like silk, the Eastern wines, the Eastern drinks, the Eastern fashion. Women, of course, were bowled over by it. They wanted so many of these things that they happily paid for them. So the economists tell us that you get the beginning of an imbalance of payments. More money is going out than there is coming in. The Romans were buying more than they were selling. So that is going to bring trouble in the years to come. Now, as I said, more and more slaves. More and more land had to be run. Fewer and fewer people were prepared to turn their hand to the plow to run it. You hired labor. There weren't many gadgets or inventions, so you hired people to do the menial work. Slaves grew in more and more in number. It got quite fashionable. I said, if you were keen on Greek culture, for example, you decided to educate your son in Greek. How did you teach it if you didn't know it yourself? You went out and you bought a Greek slave, and he taught the boy how to speak, and if you're lucky, how to write Greek. There is an argument, quite a strong argument, to suggest that the entire teaching profession began in slavery. The Romans had their children, or their sons at any rate, taught by slaves. You had, I repeat, the problem of the city mobs with their propensity for violence. All this now had to be run by a republic which started as a little city-state in the middle of Italy. Could a city-state with those traditions and that background and that political machinery really run something as big as the coast all the way around the Mediterranean? Could a city-state republic run an empire? And I stress empire again with a little e. There was no emperor yet with a capital E. The annual elections produced 2 consuls every year. It was a republic, and they had their regular votes, and they stuck to the rules. But to all intents and purposes, Rome now had an empire. But I stress, an empire with a small e.